I'm Vicky. Really lovely to be here, sort of, with you all this morning. And yes, we're going to talk about prison work. So there's a couple of polls throughout this. So if you haven't got Poll Everywhere or access to it, you can just type in the chat and I'll be able to see what you say in the chat as well. So that's me, Crime Week, Prison Works, Vicky. So this, I'm going to start with a question. So if you can answer this for me, and like I said, if Poll Everywhere isn't working for you, then please do just pop your kind of answer in the chat. But if I was to say to you, prison works, question mark, so does prison work, what would you say? Would it be yes, no, or don't know? This is the bit where we need some kind of lift music. Whilst we wait, I won't sing to you though.
We have got some answers coming in the chat function, Vicky. Lots of people are saying, mostly are saying no. Everybody's saying no, actually.
Oh, good. Oh, so I don't know. When I just did that, can you still see the slides, or has it disappeared?
No, I can still see the Poll Everywhere slide. Yeah.
Oh, excellent! Because as soon as I open the chat, it disappears for me. Right, so yeah, so lots of no's. Oh, right, so people have read the brief here. This is good. So sometimes we get a mix, and one of the kind of key parts about this is that what are we measuring here? So if I was asking what prison works is, it's a little bit of a kind of leading question in some ways, because we don't know what we're measuring. So when we say something works, we need to know what we're measuring against. And we'll come on to talk about some of those things as we go. But this is another question to get you started, not a trick question. If I said to you, what is a prison? What would be your answer? So maybe the teachers can ask the students and compile what the kind of answer would be. What is a prison? Where criminals go to be punished. Freedom taken away is the punishment. Oh, brilliant, Megan. A place for offenders to serve their punishment. An institution that holds criminals to keep them away from society. Excellent. Are you sure you haven't all been on my course already? I'm thinking maybe you should be giving the lecture. I can see a few more people type in. So let's see. Oh, you've got some now. Good. I'm glad everyone can hear me. Legal system uses punishment for people who disobey the law and a risk to society. Yeah, so punishment, solitary confinement for offenders to serve their sentence and rehabilitate. Or it can be in a solitary sense, absolutely. Yeah, so some really good ones there. So if we take a kind of dictionary definition of these, and we've got an Oxford Cambridge here. Let's keep it fair. A building in which people are legally held. So you see some of the points that you were bringing out there, saying about a building or an institution, about the law, legally held as punishment for a crime they have committed or while awaiting trial. Now, that's one thing we sometimes forget about with prison, is that we tend to assume that everyone in prison deserves to be there. But also that everyone has been convicted, when actually some people are detained within prison whilst they're either awaiting trial or awaiting a sentence. So if they haven't yet had a trial, they are legally innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. So that hasn't happened. So we do technically have innocent people, legally innocent people within prisons. And also whilst awaiting sentencing. So people can be remanded into prisons, called remand, whilst they're awaiting a sentence, which might not be a prison sentence. We won't go into all of those kind of ins and outs today, but just to show you that it's, even when we think something's quite simple, when it comes to prisons, it generally isn't. It's very complex. And the Cambridge English Dictionary tells us it's a building where criminals are forced to live as a punishment. So you see building, punishment, criminal, crime, the kind of things that you were all bringing out in your responses there. So that's brilliant. Thank you. So prisons, buildings, look generally in this country, something like this. And they have a kind of wide range. This is Wandsworth Prison in London, which is a Victorian prison, so quite old. We have some more modern prisons, which look a little bit different, a little bit less austere than this. But this generally, there's some kind of gate where the security vans that you can see on the left there go in and out from, and there's a building that houses prisoners. And the inside, if you've never been in a prison, and it is quite a, for good reason, restricted space. So this is one of the reasons that people like me and lots of others are so interested in what happens behind those closed doors, because it is a very private, closed, cut off world in lots and lots of ways. So this is a kind of standard, what's called a landing. So you'll see there's a number of kind of bits of stairs there. Some go up, some go down. Depending on the size of the prison, there can be usually 4 kind of levels to each wing, and each one of them is called a landing. And you'll see the netting there so that people don't throw things from the top to the bottom, including themselves sometimes, sadly. So all of those little kind of alcoves there, they would be cells, individual cells off there. So you can see just at a glance how many people could potentially be living in one wing. And remember this, to all intents and purposes, these are their homes. So when people are out on what's called association, the individuals that live there, it looks a bit busier like this, you can see, but generally the same kind of thing, association on the wing landings. Another thing to kind of note there is there's one prison officer with all of those prisoners. Maybe there might be another one just to the right. So generally speaking, prisoners outnumber prison officers, which is a key part of the kind of relationship and the way and the mechanisms and with how prison works. It works quite often on the kind of consent of the prisoners, that they and the goodwill to kind of follow the rules and behave and do those kind of things, because as you can see there, those prison officers would very quickly be outnumbered by the amount of prisoners that are there if the prisoners wanted to react in a certain way. So those kind of relationships and how rules and things happen within the prison are really important in terms of maintaining the goodwill and the kind of safety and security of the prison environment. So this is what a kind of cell would potentially look like. A lot of people have to share cells, so I'll come on to say a bit about this later, but we've had an overcrowded prison estate every year for about the past 18 to 20 years, I think. So some part of the prison estate is overcrowded. We're above what we should be for our kind of normal occupancy. So most people that are in prison have to share a cell, and some people have there are 3 in a cell when we've been at the height of overcrowding. It's generally 2 now. So this is so you can see how getting on with your pad mate, as they're quite often called, would be really important, because there's not much room in there. And if you've ever shared a room with a sibling or anything like that, you can probably empathise with personal space. And what you can't see there is in that room, there will be a toilet as well, which are generally completely unscreened. So you can imagine that there can be some tensions and kind of distress as well. So if you're upset, your cellmate's gonna feel it too. So you can see how getting on together would be really important. And until you start sharing a cell, that person could be a complete and utter stranger to you. So some of the kind of anxiety and negotiation that goes on in prison cells is really interesting. Some recent research that's coming out about this, actually. It's very interesting. So in terms of what the kind of prisons landscape is, we currently have 117 prisons across the prison estate, 104 of which are run by Her Majesty's Prison Service, so are in the kind of public domain. We have 3 private companies which operate the other 13, which are kind of contracted out prisons, so are run in a private way. So 13 private prisons, 104 public prisons across the estate. And this changes. So sometimes we kind of close down a prison for it to be refurbished, or for good. Sometimes new prisons get built, although we haven't had a new one built for a little while. And so things do change, but this is the current state of play. And as of the end of December, so, you know, a month ago, we had just over 79,000 people in prison. So, you know, a high number, but not as high as it has been. And the vast majority of these prisoners held in custody are male prisoners. So almost 76,000 and around 3,000 females. And to look after all of those people within custody, because that is essentially what you know, there's a duty of care to. The prison service employs 58,000 full-time staff, of which just over 22,000 are prison officers. So they're involved in the day-to-day management of the prisoners and the prison order. And just to give you a bit of an idea of how those prisons are spread out, there will have been changes. This is a map, I think, from maybe 2011. So there will have been changes, but you can see they're kind of spread out across the country. Scotland has a slightly different criminal justice system, so it's not. This is the England and Wales map. But some things to note is the kind of the spread, and you can see they're quite centralised. There's quite a good number, or a amount of prisons within that kind of central belt. But as we get out to the kind of extremes, especially in the kind of Welsh sector there, you can see that if you were sent to prison in Wales and you were from North Wales, then you would be a long way from your home potentially, and that has impacts for visiting and all of those kind of things. And that happens in the female estate and in the youth estate as well, because they're smaller in number than the adult male population. The number of prisons for women and for juveniles in particular are more kind of dispersed around the country because we have less of them. So you might be further away from your home, which can have impacts, like I said, for maintaining contact, particularly in terms of visitation. So when we're looking at the aims of imprisonment, which is a really important question when we start to think about prison quality and asking this question of prison works, you need to ask yourself, or I'm going to ask you, what you think the aim or purpose of prison in the UK is. Or to put it another way, what do we aim to achieve by sending people to prison? So what we aim to do and what we actually do are two different things. But what we aim to do really sets up that idea of how we evaluate what we're doing with people in prison. So this might not load. Oh, it is loading. So that's the poll everywhere, but do feel free to use the chat and the questions there. So what do we aim to achieve by sending people to prison? What do you think? Deterrence, yeah. Rehabilitation, excellent. Oh, 2 for rehabilitation. Public safety, protect society, rehabilitation, yeah. Punishment, yeah. Aims to deprive offenders of liberties but acting as a deterrent, yeah, excellent, Lucy, yeah. Prevent reoffending and recidivism, yes, absolutely. Protect them from themselves, yeah, interesting. This is maybe a restorative function. Achieve justice, yes, however we define justice, which is another one of those muddy, tricky concepts to define and to get a kind of consensus on. Yeah, excellent, really, really brilliant. Let me just go back to this. Cool. So let's move on from that, if it lets me. There we go. Right, so brilliant. So the kind of associated questions with that I'm not going to ask you, but to kind of leave you with is, what do you think our aim should be? Are those things you're popping in there things that you think we should be doing, or things that we are doing? And can we achieve these aims? So as I kind of mentioned there about, if we're saying this, that prison should be a form of justice, then what is justice? And what does that mean who is justice for? Is it for the victim? Is it for the victim's family? Is it for the offender? Is it for society? How do we fulfill those aims? And this is one of the really, really tricky parts about prison quality, prison effectiveness, and whether prison works, is how do we reconcile and fulfill all of these different aims of imprisonment, but in the prison system, or the penal system, I should say, criminal justice more widely. It's a really, really fundamental problem. So the prison service, they don't run every prison. Remember, the private sector have their own kind of mission statements, but they're kind of they have to kind of answer to the same principles as the public sector. So this is the prison service's official statement of purpose. So Her Majesty's Prison Service serves the public. So some of you were putting that public element in your responses about aims there. By keeping in custody those committed by the courts. Our duty is to look after them with humanity, really important point, and to help them lead law-abiding and useful lives in custody and after release. So quite a lot there. So their objectives, overarching objective, is to protect the public and to provide what commissioners want to purchase. So you can see the kind of financial, economic aspect that prisons have to abide by these days. And because of this, we have a public and a private sector. The public sector prisons, if they're not performing well to the commissioners, they can be put out to tender, and the private sector can compete with the public sector to run that prison. And that's what they mean. They want to be the provider of choice for prisons. So to achieve this, what they're setting their aims and objectives is to hold prisoners securely, to provide safe and well-ordered establishments in which they treat prisoners humanely, decently and lawfully, and to reduce the risk of prisoners reoffending. So all of those things, one or more of you had said in the chat there, so that's brilliant. So let's have a look at these individually. I'm just keeping an eye on the time because, as Lauren can attest to, I tend to talk a lot. So just want to make sure we're covering everything. So holding prisoners securely, let's have a look. So this is a graph, which should have a title, very bad academic, of the number of escapes from prison across the years from 1995-96 to last year's 2019-2020. I'll show you the latest data in a second. So you can see that we used to have a relatively high number of escapes, and this wasn't just escapes from establishments, this was escapes from escorts and hospital and all different types of things. So I think that was 88 escapes in the 95-96 period, and this is 16 escapes in 2019-20. So you can see that it's really declined, and there's been some kind of up and downs, but there's been a real decline in the number, and this has been in response to increased security measures, increased kind of physical security, but also what's sometimes called dynamic security. So relationships between the staff and the prisoners. So this is, sorry if that's a bit small, but this is the data a bit more spread out in since 2012 to 2021. So last year's data, and you can see that it was 5 last year. So we've gone down even more. And as a percentage of the population, even 88 prisoners escaping is a very small percentage. But when we look at 5, we're talking, like 1,000th of the population. It's not, it's hardly anything. Not that makes it no one should be escaping in the prison service's eyes. But you can see that there was 0 escapes from establishments. No one escaped from a prison. They were all from what's called a contractor escort. So the G4S vans you see driving prisoners to and from court. Generally, that's where the escapes happened, was when they were in the control or the management of someone other than the prison service. which the prison service likes to tell you. And we haven't had, so category A prisoners, if you don't know, are the most risky, or seen as the most risky or dangerous level of prisoners. They've got the highest level of risk. They tend to be held in the maximum security settings, or at a high level of security. And we've had in the last 15 years 2 category A escapes in 2012 and 2013, but none since. And you can see the escape still at large after 30 days. Most people get recaptured very quickly, but sometimes people can go on the run for a bit longer. So I think we'd probably say we do quite well at holding prisoners securely. 5 escapes and none from an establishment is a pretty good, a good level of security. So, do we provide safe and well-ordered establishments? Safety in prisons has deteriorated rapidly during the last 9 years. So it wasn't ever perfect, but those kind of feelings of safety amongst the people within prison has really, really deteriorated. And inspectors, this is the prison inspectors. So there's an inspectorate that have a team of inspectors that go in and inspect prisons on a kind of rolling basis, a bit like Ofsted. They go in and they can do an unannounced inspection, so just turn up at the door, or they have a kind of a schedule of announced inspections where they go and they have access to every part of the prison. And they do lots of kind of surveys with prisoners, interviews, those kind of things, to really get underneath what's happening in the prison system, as well as observing all of the aspects. So inspectors found that safety was not good in more than half of men's prisons they visited during 2019-20. So this is in the latest kind of set of reports. And almost half of people in men's prison and women's prison, so very similar percentages there, 48 and 49, said they'd felt unsafe at some point in prison. And now there's a lot of things that go into safety, but some of the ways that they measure safety and well-being in prison is the number of deaths. So we've had these have all increased. The death rate, as it says there, has been rising in the last decade. And we've had a large number of people die in prison in the last year. Obviously, as we all know, we're still in the grips of a pandemic, and a lot of those have been due to COVID. But even taking the COVID deaths out, we're still seeing a kind of a rise in all kind of causes of death. And the most disturbing really are people that take their own life. So people that have self-inflicted death, as it's called here. So almost a fifth of those people that died in prison were self-inflicted, 80 of which were men. So this is obviously reflective of the population, but also that is a trend, that the men in prison are more likely than women to take their own life. But women are more likely to self-harm, which is another form of or way that the distress and safety and feelings of personal safety are kind of measured. Now, it's an imperfect measure in lots and lots of ways, but what these kind of measures show is this kind of feeling of distress, of disorder, of this kind of cultural aspects almost within prisons that has a lot of violence and a lot of kind of personal violence. And although rates of self-harm have come down in this last year, they're at the second highest level ever recorded. And women, like, as I said, account for a disproportionate number of self-harm incidents, but it's really been on the rise in the male population as well. But it's a disproportionate number for women still. So 22% of all self-harm incidents in the last year were with women, even though they're only 4% of the total prison population. So that level of kind of personal distress is really felt in the female estate. And assaults and serious assaults have declined in the pandemic, mostly because people have been locked in their cells and they haven't had the normal kind of opportunities for those kind of prisoner-on-prisoner assaults in particular. And assaults on staff have decreased slightly as well since the kind of peak there in 2017, but they haven't decreased as far as prisoner-on-prisoner assaults have. And again, this is probably due to the fact that staff and prisoners still interact during these pandemics, and it's been a very stressful time in lots of ways. So yes, so there are that aspect of providing safe and well-ordered establishments. It's although it's an imperfect measure, there is a lot of distress and disorder in prison. So we could question whether we're providing safe and well-ordered establishments when 50% of people in prison feel unsafe. And the second part of that, so safe and well-ordered whilst treating prisoners humanely, decently and lawfully. Again, we've got this definition issue. So what does humane, decent and lawful mean within the context of prison? And there's lots of academic literature that tries to kind of discuss that. So I haven't got time to go into that now. But essentially, are people treated as human beings in a decent manner, in a lawful manner, some way that you would expect people to be treated decently. So this was some of the responses to the Inspectorate report when they asked people. They were talking about incentives and earned privileges, which is the kind of system of privileges within prison that you can kind of earn rewards almost. And they were responding to that, and some of which came out was this idea about needs in prison. And the Inspectorate found that material needs, or basic material needs, were not being met. So people in prison wanted access to fresh air. So, a very base, need and want, and things that's freely available, but not freely available when you're locked in your cell for 23.5 hours a day. Fresh air, fresh fruit, access to legal photocopying so that they can, do their legal work, towels that are clean, medication they need, and underwear that fits. These kind of basic provisions necessary for health and decency, as they say here, undermines anything else. So when people aren't having or not feeling like they're having their legitimate basic needs met, it's very tricky for them to be able to respond in a, as I was saying earlier, that kind of goodwill way to other things, to respond to the regime, so go into work, go into programmes, all of those kind of things. And that underneath there is a quote from a prisoner. How can we talk about incentives when we can't even get the basics right, like safety, toilet roll and clean socks? So you can imagine these are people that are captive, and we can put the kind of morality of that aside, but these are basic human needs that they've got no real power to get themselves. They're captive. They need people to provide these things for them. And alongside this kind of basic physical material needs are the basic psychological needs, like feeling safe, access to mental health and addiction services. So many prisoners have addiction problems, and spending time outside, that fresh air, that, being able to breathe in fresh air is really important from a mental health point of view. And these were frequently left unmet. So only 2 in 5 men and around half of women with mental health problems said that they felt that they had them helped whilst in prison. And this comes back, all of this comes down to, resource and staffing, and how the staff and the prisoners interact, and that these relationships are really vital for offsetting some of these kind of potential problems in the prison system. And that prisoner quote there is really telling. So someone believing in you is transformative for people in prison. So you will hear from prison officers about the one person they've managed to get through to, or the one person they've connected with, because sometimes they can't, there's too many of them, or maybe people aren't in a good place. But for some people, having someone show belief in them, and quite often that's a prison officer or maybe another member of staff, is really transformative and gives them that kind of push to be able to think, I can do something more positive with my life. So that brings us back to those ideas of reformation and rehabilitation. And is that what we're aiming for in a prison sense? So, do we reduce the risk of reoffending, which is one that is really, really key, and one that is quite often touted as the key measure of effectiveness of criminal justice sanctions, punishments in general, not just prison. Again, it's a very tricky concept to pin down in terms of data. So how do we know who's reoffending? Is it just those people that are convicted? Well, actually, probably a lot more people are offending than that. How do we measure the rate of reoffending? Do we say if they've committed a less serious offence, that can be a sign of some form of recidivism? Generally, it's if they've committed a crime, any crime, that are counted as a recidivist rather than a desister. So reoffending rates are generally high, and for those serving short sentences of less than 12 months, the rates are even higher. So we see these rates, and you can see there's kind of, when you kind of aggregate these, it tends to come out at around 50%. So around 50% of people are reoffending, but you can see that the changes there. Children tend to reoffend at a higher rate, lots to do with their kind of stage in offending. Most people grow out of crime, for example, by their 20s, even if they were prolific before that. But this 12-month sentence is much higher. They are very inefficient in terms of what we're aiming to achieve with prisoners, because there's very little time to do anything with them. By the time they're in, they've got their sentence, they've probably already got time served, they'll probably be let out, before that 12-month period, and there's nothing. They're just holding them for an amount of months, so they very quickly return quite often. So when we see this, and we compare it with community sentences, for people that are prolific offenders, when we're using a short-term sentence rather than a community sentence, the odds of reoffending increase. So we've got to start asking ourselves, when we're talking about prison works, or what works, is, well, what are we basing this on? If our aim is to reduce reoffending for certain portions of people, then prison is completely ineffective. So why aren't we looking at something else? We'll come back to that on another day. But some factors affecting reconviction, you might already have a good knowledge of these, and they're quite intuitive in some ways. So receiving family visits, so maintaining those family connections is so vitally important, but so tricky in prison. So you can see the difference in reconvictions there between people who had no visits and people who did have visits, quite a stark 20% difference in reoffending. People who were living with their family on immediate release, again, about this family connection, this kind of, being bonded to something is really important. And you can see that those living with family also had a lower rate of reconviction. Drugs, we're coming back to this kind of theme of drugs here and the kind of importance. So a lot of people come in with a drug problem, or an addiction problem, I should say, not always just drugs, but if they are continuing or go back to using Class A drugs in particular here upon release, you can see that that's an over 30% difference in reoffending. So really targeting our response to addiction is really vitally important. And jobs is a really, really important, again, to this kind of idea of having something bigger than yourself, something that you're responsible for, and creating a positive pro-social aspect to your life. And you can see there's a 20% difference there between those that are employed and those that are unemployed. But as I'm sure you all know and have awareness of, getting a job once you have been in prison in particular can be very, very tricky. So the prison service tries to help with all of these factors. And accommodation on the first night following release is a really important target. But as you can see, of all of the prisons, only 17 out of the 98 that gave data for this achieved that target. So knowing that the people that were released from prison on any day had accommodation, so had somewhere to go, they only 17 reached that target. And employment, so one of their key performance targets is to get them employment from 6 weeks, and this obviously moves into the probation service, part of this process too. Only 4 out of the 99 prisons that provided data achieved that target. So you can see that these things that are really important, we're failing at quite dramatically in terms of providing support for it. So let's have a little recap. Do we protect the public? So remember, these are the things that they aim to do. On the left there, protect the public is the umbrella concern by holding prisoners securely, providing safe and well-ordered establishments, and reducing the risk of offending. So we're pretty good at keeping people securely in prison, locked in, basically. We're pretty good at that. Still needs to be some work done on providing safe and well-ordered establishments, and we're not so good at reducing reoffending. So let's see whether we can decide whether prison works. And Lord Wolfe, which some of you may have heard of, he used to be the chief inspector of prisons, and he did the report into the Strangeways riots, which happened in the early 90s. That was a response, or the rioting was a response to these atrocious living conditions that the prisoners had, and they were saying that this is not legitimate, it's not okay, this is not humane, it's not decent, it's not lawful, although we didn't have that terminology then. That's post-Wolfe report. But he's a very, very savvy man, and says the prison service has to live with prisoners during their time in prison. The rest of the country lives with them afterwards. We cannot afford to lock them up and forget them. We must ensure that the service makes proper use of the time that a prisoner spends in prison and the best use of the money available. The aim must be to reduce the likelihood of prisoners reoffending after release. So this is really important, and this key point about prison service living with them, the rest of us protecting the public, extends beyond the time they're incapacitated in prison. We do a good job, essentially, of protecting the public by incapacitating people in prison. We keep them in prison securely. That we do a good job at that. But protecting the public extends further than that. If they're going to come out, commit another crime, which will probably involve another victim, very few crimes are victimless, and then go straight back into prison, that's not protecting the public in the long term. And the vast majority of prisoners will be released from prison. So there are very few prisoners that will spend the rest of their natural lives in prison. We do have some that are given what's called a whole life sentence, and they will never be eligible for parole. But the vast majority of other prisoners will either come out on a designated day if they've got a determinate sentence, or if they've been given a life sentence, will have the opportunity at least to be released. So this is an important aspect, is that protecting the public and what happens also beyond the prison gates. So just to recap from the kind of academic side, what the aims of imprisonment are to be: retribution, and I think when I asked you that question, what do you think we aim to achieve in prison, you covered all of these things, which is brilliant. So retribution, so this idea that there's punishment or just desserts for prisoners, so they should be punished for the crime that they committed. Incapacitation, so this idea of protecting public, so keeping this criminal group away from the rest of us. Deterrence, so putting off others, but also putting off themselves. So there's a kind of individual level deterrence there. So this idea that if we send people to prison, it should be a horrible place to put them off. I'm not saying that I agree with any of these necessarily, but there are kind of nuance in there we'll have a look at a bit more in a minute. And rehabilitation, so reforming characters. And restoration, so restoring justice to victim, society, and also the person. So, you know, is there an element of restoring or restorative aspects within the offender or the criminal themselves? What could we restore them to be? A decent member of society, a useful member of society, as the prison service objective goes. So that's what the kind of literature says. We talk about these different aims. And when we're looking at these things, can prison fulfill all of these things? Should it be aiming to fulfill all of these things? So, you know, there's some kind of, discussion about, are we trying to do too much by saying that prison should fulfill all of these different aims? Can we do it? Are we setting ourselves up for failure? Are we setting ourselves up for the fact that prison doesn't work? So, quick question. if I had to ask you what you think this building is, what would you say? Pop in the chat for me. If you saw this picture in the newspaper or anywhere else, what would you think that this building was? Lauren thinks it's a school. Yes, or could be a school. Yep. University. Yeah. School. Yeah, it's definitely got a school university look, hasn't it? Or maybe a psychiatric hospital. Yeah. Can see a hospital idea there. A prison in Sweden. Rosie. Close. Museum. Yes, I hadn't thought of that, but actually, yeah, I can see that. So yes, let's just show you a few more. So nice. I mean, I wouldn't mind our kind of like staff common room to look like that. That looks quite nice. Nice wooded area there. I mean, the fence might give you a little bit of an idea, but some nice pieces of art. We've got some lovely bits of art around our university walls. It looks quite similar to that. I'm sure hopefully you've got some lovely pieces of student art around your different schools. Now, when I went to university quite a long time ago, my student room was not that nice. It definitely wasn't that nice, but that could be a student room, a student dorm room. But you were correct. Well, it's in Norway. It's a prison, a maximum security. So this is a maximum security prison called Halden in Norway, but it is a prison. And they've got some Banksy style art, which is quite amusing and nice. So I'm just going to show you this short video. And Lauren, I assume we've got till 11, so I think I'm doing okay for time.
Yeah, don't worry, Vicky. If it does run over slightly anyway, it's not a problem. If students can stay and they've got questions, no problem.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. I think I'm coming to the end now, so there should still be plenty of time for questions. But this is just a little video that shows you. So the way I'm moving here is this kind of idea of what can we do differently, and this is just a video about prison by design. So how can we do prisons differently? So hopefully you can all hear this.
These photos look like they're from a hotel or a fancy college dorm room. There's a gym, common areas, and private bedrooms. But this place, just outside Halden, Norway, is a prison. There's no barbed wire, lots of greenery, and striking contemporary art. Inmates even have pretty great views out of their cell windows. It's all part of a plan to make prisons more humane through design. The underlying philosophy behind humane prison design argues that the look and feel of a prison shouldn't be a punishment.
The sentence is taking away the freedom. Everyday life shouldn't be a sentence.
And the first thing designers focus on is the basic architecture of prison buildings. In most prison architecture, facilities are consolidated into one contiguous building. A courtyard design uses a rectangular building around a central outdoor space. In a telephone pole design, rows of buildings are stacked like a ladder. And radial designs have corridors that branch out from a central hub, like spokes on a wheel. While these layouts are good for moving lots of inmates around efficiently, they restrict prisoners to identical indoor hallways day after day. And tight quarters can unintentionally create tension and conflict. So humane prisons are often laid out in a campus design, where facilities are split between separate buildings with a surrounding perimeter wall. At Norway's Halden prison, housing is located here, while education and visitation spaces are here, in separate buildings. This means most inmates have to start their day with a commute, mimicking life in the outside world and providing easy access to outdoor physical activity. And unlike other layouts, which have windows that look out onto the prison itself, campus design gives inmates a rich view of their surrounding environment. This access to nature also helps inmates track the passage of time.
The inmates felt that they were in a diving bell. They were disconnected with time and with space.
Spending time outside and seeing days and seasons pass through windows helps reduce this problem. Plus, the grounds of humane prisons are usually landscaped carefully. At Halden, tall birch and pine trees dwarf the buildings and obscure the perimeter wall, lending what designers call an anti-authoritarian feel to the campus. Inmates are never made to feel intimidated by the architecture itself. Building materials influence humane design too. In other prisons, interiors are made from hard materials like concrete, linoleum, and steel. Materials like this block light, are visually unappealing, and constantly reflect noise. In prisons like Halden, you'll see glass to let in natural light, and materials like cork and wood to muffle noise. But humane prison design isn't just about architecture and materials. It's also about what happens inside the walls. Halden's design affects the way correctional officers and inmates interact. Because housing is broken up into small communities with a shared kitchen and communal space, correctional officers can easily monitor inmates through regular face-to-face contact instead of observing large groups of people from a distance. And the guards' rooms are intentionally designed too small to incentivize them to move out into the inmates' common area.
And this, that the guards are together with the inmates, is a very important security system.
Campus layouts help that relationship flourish. A study of architecture in Dutch correctional facilities found that campus design ranked highest in inmate-staff relationships. And U.S. prison studies from the late 90s found that this style of direct contact resulted in fewer violent or security-related incidents. Designing these humane prisons costs money, which is why most of the groundbreaking work is happening in Western Europe and Scandinavia, where smaller prison populations and more robust social support systems allow for more flexible experimentation. And because U.S. prisons often prize cost saving over design, it's still uncommon to see them here. But places like Halden are setting a new precedent for what the prison of the future could look like.
It's so important to have a human behavior towards people, so they are not so angry, but give them human dignity.
It might feel counterintuitive to create pleasant, well-designed spaces like this for people who have committed crimes. But under a design philosophy like this, being imprisoned is the punishment. The architecture doesn't have to be.
So, really interesting, just a really short video there, and there's lots and lots. The Scandinavian approach to imprisonment is so interesting, and they really do have that kind of rehabilitative philosophy, this idea that people are sent to prison as a punishment, not for continued punishment. So taking away their liberty is the punishment. And then that kind of wolf idea of, well, what do we then do with them? They're all going to come out. So in Norway, they don't have indeterminate sentencing. So even people that have committed really horrendous crimes, probably crimes that would get them a whole life tariff in this country, I think their maximum length of sentence is 21 or 22 years, and that's it. At that point, that person will come out. So they know that they've got 21 years at a maximum to do something different with that person, to make that person still feel a part of the community from which they're drawn and from which they will return to. So we don't adopt, we have some of that philosophy, absolutely, in terms of how we approach rehabilitation, but currently, and Scott is quite a kind of critical criminologist in this area about prisons, but says that prisons are part of the crime problem, not a solution to it. So what could we do differently, or what should we be doing differently? So we can learn from Norway and the other kind of Scandinavian prison approach. So unprison the prison. So do we need those kind of austere conditions that I showed you in those kind of first pictures that I kind of opened this session with? Do we need them to look like that? Do we need them to feel like that in order to be punishing? Is the punishment just the loss of liberty? The fact that through that loss of liberty, you can't kiss your children goodnight at night. You can't choose what you have for dinner every night or go outside whenever you feel like it. So do we need these kind of continued levels of punishment over and above the pain of that loss of liberty already? Focus on relationships, both inside and outside, vitally important, as you've seen. Even those kind of design aspects there that encourage that relationship between staff and prisoners, who are day to day the people that they see and those repeated interactions and those relationships are really important, both for security, but also well-being and distress and all of those kind of things. Trust, empathy, humanity, decency, all of those things. So focus on individuals rather than homogenous groups. So don't look at people as I've said a number of times throughout this session, adult men. Well, that's quite a differentiated group. Women who have generally been treated in the kind of prison system as or the prisons have been designed for men because they're mostly male prisons, and then women have been put in them. So I think there's a kind of quote that says women's prisons are male prisons minus the urinals and painted pink. I mean, they're not kind of fit for purpose. They're not fit for the needs and responses of women. So, for example, some women might be pregnant when they go to prison. Some women might have small children with them, that they can, keep their babies with them for so long. What kind of experience is that? A lot of people are parents. That includes the men in prison as well. How do we respond to that? How do we keep those kind of relationships? Focus on desistance, so the stopping of offending rather than reoffending. So although they're kind of two sides of the same coin, traditionally we've focused all our attention on why people continue to offend, why people reoffend, why people leave prison or leave a sanction and reoffend again. What we haven't traditionally focused on, it's a relatively recent criminological phenomenon, so the last kind of 30 years or so, which for criminology is relatively recent, to have this focus on desistance, so why people stop. So talk to the people who have stopped offending. And again, desistance can be a bit of a muddy concept. So, how long is a length of desistance? Because you can't actually say, well, tomorrow they might go and commit another offence, so they're not a desister. So, there's this idea that you can't actually say someone's desisted until the day they die, and they haven't committed any crimes before that. But even so, people that we think have stopped committing crime or self-report as stopped committing crime, ask them what the kind of process is and the progress. And really important to that is this focus on hope, belief, and other people believing in you, this idea of thinking of an alternative future. And all of these things we know, they're in the literature, there's research about them, we see them in other countries. So Norway, for example, has a reoffending rate, it's not perfect, but a reoffending rate of 20%, which is kind of universally low. So they're obviously getting something right. But what they do have, in addition, different to us, is a level of resource. So their staff prisoner ratio is 1-to-1. So every single prisoner has a prison officer, really, that's there for them. We don't. We have way too many prisoners and not enough prison staff. So our resource capacity to deliver that level is reduced. So until we reduce the amount of people we send to prison, which we imprison along with Scotland, at the highest imprisonment rate in Western Europe. So you can see Norway's down there at 56, which obviously has helped keep their prison population low as well. Ours is 132, which has reduced in recent years, but not significantly. And this fuels our prison population, which you can see that graph there. That's how it's changed over the last 30 years. And it's kind of steadied and then started to decline in the last 5 or 6 years. But it's projected to rise by at least 19,000 more people by 2026. And this is fueled, or they think will be fueled, by the recruitment of 20,000 new police officers. So obviously more people out there to detect crime. And also the backlog that we currently have in court due to COVID. So there's going to be a lot more people being processed through the system. So there are a number of reasons for this projections, but they are just projections. We don't know what's going to happen, but this is what it's projected. So it's an upward trajectory again. And the other thing is reduce the length of time we send people to prison for. So this is another trend that's done nothing but kind of increase, even though it has come down slightly. So 2.5 times more people were sentenced to 10 years or more in the 12 months to June than they were in 2008. And people are now, meaning they're in prison almost 2 years longer. And you can see if we're sending more people to prison for longer, that pool of people within prison just gets bigger and bigger and bigger year on year, or at certain time points of the year anyway. So until we've addressed those kind of fundamental concerns, can we ever say that? So I was just going to end with, so do you think prison works? But you all started with no, so I'm not sure you'd end with anything different. But hopefully you can see that potentially some things about prison works. It depends on how we're defining it, but also that we could have something different. But a lot has to change, and it's kind of ducks in a row to get there. Right, so I've waffled on at you until 11, so I'm hoping you found that interesting. But if anyone's got any questions, please do pop them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them.